Hello again, and welcome back to An Aesthetic Education. I am very pleased and delighted to welcome to the show Dr. David Bellingham from Sotheby's Institute of Art in London, where he is the program director for the MA in Art Business. David holds a special honors degree in Latin and classical archaeology from the University of Birmingham and a doctorate from the University of Manchester, where his thesis work focused on ancient Roman and Pompeian wall paintings. I know there's a lot more to it than that. As an art historian, David has written books and articles on a variety of topics, including but not limited to art business ethics, the paintings of Sandro Botticelli, and authenticity issues in the paintings of Frans Hals. David also hosts his own podcast called the Art Business Podcast, where he speaks with industry experts and specialists about all the cultural and business goings on that are happening in the art world right now. I had the distinct privilege and pleasure to be one of David's students when I completed my MA in Art Business at Sotheby's this past year, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with him today. David, welcome again, and thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Jeremy. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Amazing. I'm really so happy that we could arrange this from California to London, and the beauty of technology is that we have no limits anymore when it comes to these things. So perfect. So I want us to get started. I always like to start off these little interviews with just like a step back in time and really just to ask you, what sort of sparked your interest going back, I don't know, to your childhood or at some other point, but your earliest kind of memory that you can at least, put your finger on when you were first sort of fascinated by art and creativity in some way.
Well, my family were not arty. And when I was growing up, remember, we didn't have the internet. We relied on libraries and visiting archaeological sites and museums and galleries, very often with our school, because my parents weren't particularly into doing things like that, if you like. So my mum would take me down the library every Saturday afternoon. And I do remember when I was quite young and at school, I do remember getting a book out on Andy Warhol that I think was on their display section, and leafing through that and finding that quite compelling. I didn't, obviously I couldn't place it within any kind of art historical tradition. I would certainly have been able to label it as pop art or whatever, but it was fun. I remember thinking it was very easy to look at. And, that was the issue. I mean, I was lucky there was just a book in the library that I do remember looking at. And it was probably another 15, 20 years before I actually saw Andy Warhol's in an exhibition, which curiously was when I was studying for my doctorate. I was staying in Sorrento, and there's a lovely little art school in a medieval cloisters there, which has art exhibitions, and they would have really good things. And they had this Andy Warhol prints exhibition called Heroes, which was, as it says on the tin, on the Campbell soup tin, as it were. No, it had sort of some of the images of Elvis and Jackie Kennedy and so on, and I loved it. And but to be honest, Jeremy, that by then my interests in ancient art had been sparked. Well, really ancient and Renaissance art had been sparked by my father. I think, realizing from the fact that I used to love studying Latin at school, amazingly. Yeah. So I was very much a literature person at that stage. And he really obviously used his imagination and took me to Rome. And it was just him and me. I had three sisters who stayed at home with my mother, but he took me to Rome. And I do remember going into the Sistine, into San Pietro, there, and seeing a lot of Baroque and Mannerist paintings, and the Sistine Chapel. I remember before it was cleaned. So I thought like old masters were always kind of like brown. Yeah. Whereas obviously when it was cleaned up, it was a completely different aesthetic, and you could see why everyone was shocked by what Michelangelo was doing. So, and I thought it was very over, as a kid, I thought it was rather over emotional, and, it wasn't until later that I became more attuned. I was becoming more attuned probably to classical music and opera and theatrical art. And then I really got, the next time I went back to Rome as a kind of more mature person who'd studied a bit of art by then, I really loved it. So I don't know. I hope that's an answer to your question.
No, it is. It is. I mean, there's so many. I always find it interesting because there's so many different aspects in the sense that, like, as a child, you have a memory of pop art and Andy Warhol, but then really classical art, right? The ancient world. That's what sparked an interest, which I find fascinating because people wouldn't relate the two, usually, right? In any sort of circumstance, even though there is a line that we can trace in some ways to the historical development of art, um, from the ancient world to now. But I think it's fascinating. I will say I love Sorrento. I love Rome.
Hmm.
Sorrento is a lovely place, even though they like to focus on their lemons, obviously. Um, but it is amazing, and I think for those who haven't had the pleasure or privilege to go to Rome, I can't. I mean, I don't think anybody can recommend it highly enough. My favorite museum there was the Capitoline Museum. That was outstanding when I went a few years ago. But
Which, of course, is possibly the first public museum in the world.
mhm,
I think it dates to the
exactly.
15th century as a kind of public, popular Roman rival to the Vatican
Hmm.
Museum.
Yeah, and I think what I thought was most interesting actually going there in comparison to other museums was that you could sense that history in the way that they also presented the materials and the works that they had. It was very old fashioned,
Yeah. Yep.
and in a way that was it kind of made it feel more, you're in that setting, you're in that space, and it worked really well. I don't think you could do it in other places in the same way, but in that moment, you walk up those hills, you enter that building, it's spectacular.
Yeah, and I think that it's good that they don't change the display because you'd be changing the museology, you'd be changing the way that art was displayed. I'm sure it's been changed a little bit, but certainly
Yeah.
15th, 16th, 17th, and up to 18th. I would imagine after that there haven't been many changes in the basic display. And
Mm,
and just for the listeners, of course, the Capitoline Museum is very much about ancient Roman marbles and
yeah.
bronzes, I would say, and copies of earlier Greek statues.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, frankly, what was interesting was when I was there, they had an exhibition on gravestones,
Yeah.
which was fascinating. Something that you would not necessarily connect to art. Really, people don't like to think about it in some ways, but it was both historically interesting and just shows how little has changed in terms of human beings and human nature, and certainly how we think about ourselves compared to the ancient world to now.
Yeah, and they're very moving actually, Roman.
Mm,
Assuming you mean mainly maybe Hellenistic and Rome, but
mm,
mainly Roman
yeah, mostly
tombstones.
Roman
Yeah,
Hellenistic. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
and
But
you might have a mythological scene or a portrait of the deceased, and then you have this it's the inscription in Latin, which is very
mhm,
moving. It will give the actual years, the number of years, months, and days that
yeah,
the person lived, which
exactly,
we
exactly.
probably wouldn't do today. In fact, we
No,
don't today.
we don't do it right in a lot of instances. So it shows, I think, I don't know. In some ways, there's that definitely that ancient world understanding and familiarity with death was obviously a much more centered aspect of their lives, and but I think it's reflected in a kind of beautiful way in those sorts of pieces, which is just interesting to compare. Not to get morbid this early in the day,
No,
but
it's I find them very moving. Of course, the Romans used to have we celebrate birthdays. They
mm,
used to celebrate with great joy death days, so that
yeah,
when you go to Pompeii, in the tombs were always outside the town, of course.
mm,
There was a taboo against burying the dead inside the walls,
yeah,
and quite often you'll see, like Pompeii in particular, in the Street of the Tombs, going down to the Villa de Mestres, you see these often quite monumental tombs with little sort of semicircular benches where every
mm,
year on the anniversary of the death of the loved one, you would meet and have a banquet and
yeah.
enjoy a party with them.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, I know I mentioned earlier that you did your doctorate thesis on Pompeii, essentially with the wall paintings. I mean, not
Yes.
to not to dive into that whole topic, but if you want to just give like a little, I mean, because I remember we spoke about this before one lunchtime, but if you could just give us a little sense of like what you focused on there, because I think it's a really interesting topic, and it sort of shows your background, in that sense as an art historian and where you're coming from, because your knowledge of this subject is immense.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of your listeners will be of your age group and maybe having recently graduated. And sorry, I'm just going to turn off let me just turn off my Outlook again. Otherwise, you're going to get noises. Sorry
No
about that.
worries.
Yeah, no, and I remember at that time, you have these crossroads in your life, and I think that they seem much more scary, I think, when you're in your
Mm.
20s, like which direction do I go in? And I remember we used to actually get a grant to do like a PhD for 3 years, like a
Yeah.
full-time bursary to do it from the government. You can still get them, but they're much harder to get now, I would say. Just like, my undergraduate degree was paid, my tuition fees were paid for, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I remember being offered a grant to study an MA in Renaissance Latin.
Mm.
And I at one stage I was going to edit the letters of Rubens, who wrote
Oh, wow.
classical Latin letters, and that's all been done now. So I didn't do
Yeah.
that in the end. And there were various other things I was going to do with literature. And then suddenly I just thought, actually, I don't really want to stay in the UK. I'd like to travel to do this.
Mm.
So I had a very good archaeology lecturer, Professor Tomlinson, at the time. He was a Greek archaeologist, but we'd done Roman material with him as well. And I went to see him and I said, look, I'd really like to do something on maybe that takes me to Pompeii. I really feel very attracted to the site. My father, when he'd taken me to Rome, by the way, he'd taken me to Pompeii for a day trip as well, which was amazing and eye-opening, as anyone who's been to Pompeii will know. So in the end, I decided to do, I decided on the mythological paintings. A lot have been written about them.
Yeah.
Just for the listeners who haven't been there, Pompeian interior decoration and Roman interior decoration is a complete system, often framed by kind of like architecture and like decorative elements, but very often suggesting that you're in like an art gallery, or that there are central panels on usually three of the walls, the other wall being a door for entrance to the room. And you feel as though you're almost like in an art gallery, or like today we have pictures on our walls. And the mythological paintings, many of them have been studied, but I realized that what we call genre scenes in art history, scenes of everyday life, very little have been said about those academically. So I started by studying genre scenes of everyday life. And then my tutor one day said, look, just start writing now. You've got a lot of photographs, not digital at the time. They were kind of color slides and photographs. So I started writing, and I suddenly realized I'd written 20,000 words on 3 paintings in one room, which was a triclinium, or a dining room, a banquet room. And so I went back to the tutor, and in the end, by then I changed my tutor. I had a bit of an interregnum with my PhD, as a lot of people do, and I went back to it. And I had Roger Ling, who was one of the only experts on Roman wall painting in the UK. He was at Manchester University, which validates Sotheby's degrees, as you know. In fact, I was awarded my doctorate with students, which was quite nice eventually.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Anyway, I said, I'm just going to make this doctorate about banquet scenes. But the reason, as you have said, that my thesis in the end was called symptotic scenes, which is a much less well-known word for listeners, as opposed to banquet, is that everyone had always called these things banquet scenes. But I guess one of the key points of my thesis was these aren't really banquets. They're not having like a lot of food. And the only food that I could see evidence of was like oysters. There are often oyster shells on the ground, and basically they're drinking wine and eating oysters like we do with champagne and oysters now. And so I thought, actually, these Roman scenes look to me much more like a nostalgic later version of earlier classical Greek symposium, which was much more eating sort of like little titbits and drinking wine. So that was part of that kind of thesis. So basically, that's how that happened.
Yeah, I think I love that, because I mean, just speaking for myself, when we celebrate as Jewish people, we celebrate Passover, which is coming up at the end of April. That is essentially we have a thing that we do called the Seder, which is an order, but it's essentially a recreation of a Greek symposium. And so it actually follows a very similar structure. And people don't always know that, but we have this thing called the afikoman, which is actually a Greek word, which is for dessert. We eat the unleavened bread, but obviously, in most of these cases, with these Greek symposiums, usually dessert was far more of a sexual nature with a lot of these things. So it's funny how these sort of traditions do continue, but in very different forms, thousands of years later.
I honestly didn't know that the Passover feast was based on a Greek symposium.
Yep,
Uh,
it's
yeah,
because
I
it's a
didn't realize that.
discussion, right? And also when that was actually put together, and this is a side note we're getting, but when that was put together, they were obviously it was during the Roman times was when the Seder was kind of ordered, so and organized in a formal setting. So that was the
From
nature of that
Hellenists, so
from the
so not
Hellenists.
the original Abrahamic Moses period, but
Correct.
yeah, so
So
it
yeah,
changed.
the
Yeah,
instruction to commemorate it comes from the Bible, but the way that we do it and the ceremonial pieces of how we do it came much later.
that's
So
interesting. And of course, the early catacomb paintings from the
mhm,
Christian catacombs in Rome, they actually depict the Last Supper actually as a Roman triclinium, on
correct.
couches, and
Exactly.
they
And
tend to be
that's
semicircular rather than rectangular,
mhm,
though. But that was a
e-
later development as well. So obviously,
yeah,
when Leonardo paints the Last Supper, I think actually it's probably incorrect. It probably looked far more like
probably
one of my banquet scenes or symposic scenes, or
correct.
reclining on
Correct.
couches and so on.
Correct, absolutely, and but in the time of Jesus, that would have been far more the norm,
Absolutely.
obviously,
Yeah.
than anything else. So it's interesting how all these things kind of get interconnected,
Hmm.
and obviously we've been talking a lot of this is very historical, and you were trained as an art historian, as you said, pretty much.
Well, no,
So
no. Actually, I wasn't trained as an art historian.
really,
This is quite interesting, and people may not realize this, but it's changed a little bit. But I don't
mm,
think it's changed entirely. That when you studied ancient art at
mm,
university, it was always in an archaeology department,
uh,
not a department of art history. And
right,
generally speaking, I think it's still true that if you do an art history degree, undergraduate degree at universities,
yeah,
I think it's still true that you might do a little bit of ancient Greek and Roman art in the survey of Western art history at the
sure,
start of the course. But generally speaking, the whole focus is on Renaissance, post-Renaissance,
right,
maybe a bit of
and beyond,
medieval. And so,
yeah,
I wasn't really.
mm,
We did our like classical art history, like we did things like special subjects like Greek vase painting, but it was taught
right,
by archaeologists who weren't art
okay.
historians. So I
Yeah.
had to retrain myself
Mm.
using the modern discipline of art history and using all their methodologies and reading a lot of books about art historical methods to apply them to the ancient
The
material.
ancient
And
world.
and and it was in the air. There were other people, famous people, most notably a guy called Paul Zanker, who I'd
Mm.
recommend to all of your listeners to read his books. He was at Oxford. He's a wonderfully kind person. I used to go and talk to him a lot about my research because my supervisor in Manchester was an archaeologist. So
Yeah.
I was coming out with all this kind of what he thought was very non-empirical theoretical art history for material he saw as very empirical and material. And
Yeah.
it was people talking with people like Yash Elsner that that who understood the art history. So
Mm.
it's just quite interesting the way those
It
disciplines
is.
were
We're
divided. Really.
very separate. Even obviously we look at it as there's overlap. But clearly also, when you look at them and also I think as from a technical perspective, when you're doing archaeological work, it's very different if you actually are going out there and
Yeah,
looking for things and all of that stuff. The
and
whole
and an
sense of
awful
discovery.
yeah, and a lot of academic authors on what we might call Greek and Roman art history
Mm.
are diggers. They're
Right.
archaeologists. They spend their
Yeah.
summers digging, and they come back and write about it. But I think certainly, I think it has increased as an as a subsector of art historical, as an academic discipline, to
Mm.
study it through an art historical methodological lens. Now that has
Right.
changed in the last generation.
Yeah. So then jumping off of that, do you think that in some ways, because I think, some of our listeners, I know will not come from art, history backgrounds or are necessarily as knowledgeable on all these kind of topics that we've been discussing. But what's the sort of benefit that you think? And that's a big question, but what's the kind of, the importance of having that historical knowledge and the historical context when looking at a piece of art?
Well, I think there's lots of ways of answering that. I mean, if you think of a lot of living contemporary artists, when they're interviewed or even looking at their work, a lot of them are very, very aware of history, of themselves working, even with contemporary art in a kind of quite historical tradition. There are, there are a lot of references by a lot of well-known internationally renowned contemporary artists to the history of art. I mean, the most recent one that was the subject of one of my podcasts actually was an artist called Kojo Marfo. He's an African artist based in London now. And we talked a lot in that podcast, and I did an introduction to an exhibition of his. And I'd said, am I right in saying that there's quite a lot, although these are ostensibly Black African people that we're looking at in these group portraits, that there's a lot of references to like Western art history? And he said, oh, definitely. I go around the museums all the time. I'm incorporating all of those layers into my art because I believe in, it signifies my own personal beliefs that we're all related, be we black or white or male or female or whatever our sexuality or religious beliefs are. So and people like Damien Hirst, of course, I think a lot of this religious aspect is not people don't really want to think that someone like Damien Hirst is actually very interested in, say, Judeo-Christian religions, where, I some of the most memorable Hirst exhibitions of the early noughties, when White Cube, which represented him at that time, was out at Hoxton. I remember he turned the rectangular 20th century White Cube building there into like a chapel. And and then the altarpiece was butterflies, which he quite rightly said the ancient Greek word for butterfly is psyche, and that means soul. So he believed in kind of like the transmigration of souls in a kind of Judeo-Christian sense. And then he was also asked by a church, I just don't remember what it's called, it's opposite Deutsche Bank, next to the Roman medieval wall of London. Is it St. Dunstan's by the wall, something like that? He was actually asked by the church to come and actually decorate it. So he did a Damien Hirst altarpiece, like with a silver skull pierced by nails, and that was actually used for the Eucharist. And I think so. That is one aspect of history, like the religious part. But Tracy Emin, when asked what her favorite work of art was, it's a Renaissance wooden four-poster bed called the Bed of Ware in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and you can see how that relates to My Bed, which is Tracy Emin's most famous work. The Unmade Bed, and So I mean, that's one answer to why I think knowing about the history of art and about his history is very important for our understanding of today's art world.
Yeah, I think when we sort of look at that, there's a lot of people feel overwhelmed, right? They don't know where to start. They're not sure how to look at these things. They think it's too difficult to understand all the context, all the symbolism, all the clues, right? That might be present. And I sort of want people, what they've learned, hopefully by listening to this podcast and your podcast as well, is that there's ways to enter this space without formal training, to actually learn and understand without feeling overwhelmed. But it is important. You can't appreciate it fully without having that historical context, because everything has to be placed within that arc and that sense of history.
And it's overwhelming when you begin. I mean, we've all been there. You've been there. I've been there, where you feel a sense of, oh gosh, I'm so ignorant compared to my fellow students or fellow human beings. Obviously in the art world, a lot of my students are brought up in an art collecting or an art loving family, and they have cultural capital, which I never had. But I think if you've got my father just lit the blue touch paper, as it were, by taking me to Rome and Pompeii, and that just led me as I'm naturally inquisitive, and I just wanted to know a lot more about the mythology, which is then a fascinating journey, all interconnected, and about symbolism. And these days, of course, then you had to have a book of symbols in art. You had to read your Bible again. You had to get into your Greek myths. Nowadays, of course, you could just go on your smartphone and, you've got no excuse not to look up what is a feather symbolic of in a Dutch painting, So there's no excuse not to get into it. I think what puts people off is that it takes a little bit of time and effort. And
Hmm.
in today's world, people feel overwhelmed by not having enough time to investigate things.
Sure. Exactly. So hopefully, hopefully this kind of sparks that interest a little bit. But segueing, obviously, we met on, I was on the art business course at Sotheby's in London. It's a very different lens to look at the art world from the art business sense to an art historical sense. So, what brought you to that art business side of the industry, so to speak?
Well, like so much in the art world, and so many of the people that have been my guests on my podcast, I don't think any of them have had a straight route into that art world. There's a lot of serendipity involved. There isn't an obvious career structure. In some ways, it's a bit of an exclusive world because you don't tend to see a lot of the jobs advertised. But as our students learn, it's about going around and going into galleries in your spare time and speaking to the curators. And maybe they think, oh, would you like to do an internship? And, and it gradually grows like that. There are people in quite high jobs in places like Sotheby's and Christie's that when you talk to them, they started as porters, with very little knowledge of art, but they fell for it, and they used to listen to people, listen to specialists and collectors and so on, and they often make their way in a very unorthodox, uneducated manner into that art world. If you listen to my recent podcast with David Preston, he's now, the head of Crown Fine Art
Hmm.
Logistics for UK
Yeah.
and Ireland. And in that podcast, he makes the point that he left school when he was 16, and now he spends his time, moving very well-known artists' works and meeting very well-known art collectors, and what an exciting world it is. So the way I got into art business, just in a nutshell, if I can,
Hmm.
is I used to teach in a orthodox classical studies university department in West London. I That was a 0.6, a fractional post. So I used to make up my income by doing cultural tours abroad, in Italy, Rome, Sicily, Pompeii, Turkey, North Africa, etc. Which was wonderful because I was seeing stuff that I wouldn't otherwise have been able to afford to get to myself, and I also did teaching, of my, because there aren't that many people in London even today who you can reach out to and say, could you do a few lectures on Greek vase painting or Roman wall painting or whatever. So I won't go into how this happened, but I met someone who was working at Sotheby's on this course called Styles in Art, which was a survey course at the start of what used to be the undergraduate degree. They stopped
Hmm.
teaching. We might go back to it, by the way. And
Okay, exciting.
I did the first few weeks of that on Greek and Roman art. And apparently I got good feedback from the students. They loved it. We went to the museums and so on. And one day in 1999, Alison Smith, who now works at the National Portrait Gallery, she had been offered a job at Tate Britain,
Mm.
and so which she took. And she was leading that course at Sotheby's Institute. And she rang me up and said, look, I'm leaving this, which I just wondered whether you might be interested in the job.
Mhm.
And I said, yeah, no, definitely. It'd be very exciting to work in a different kind of place, like a private education institution linked to the art market.
Yeah,
And so I had to be interviewed and everything. And in the end, I was offered the job, and I started in January 2000. So it was really like a new millennium job,
it
a real
was.
break. I stayed in that for a couple of years, teaching, lead directing this art history survey. And then halfway through, I think it was 2002 or 2003, the program director of the MA in Art Business, which had started in 98, for personal reasons dropped out. And so they asked me whether I could just temporarily, they said, we can find someone else to do this. We can't find, we think that you'll be a good director for this. And I said, well, look, I know nothing about business. They said that, the students just want someone who maybe cares for, that you're,
Mhm.
that. So anyway, I did that. There were 18 students that year, and it was halfway through the academic year. I met them all individually, and I asked them questions about, how's it going and what would you like to see in the second semester after Christmas. They all said, we'd like to go to TFAF, the European Fine Art Fair. We
Yeah.
don't do any study trips on this course. So I kind of introduced the study trips, which we're
Mhm.
going to be doing that in a couple of weeks' time, going out to the Netherlands. So that was the
Yep.
birth of study trips abroad as well. And um, I just dug my heels in immediately. It was an incredibly exciting world. You know this, that
We
there's
do.
news every day. There's
Yeah.
art world news every day, particularly market related. And I just found it so incredibly exciting. It was a steep learning curve because I knew nothing about contemporary art. I didn't, I knew a little bit about old masters, and I'd written academically about particularly artists working in the classical tradition like Botticelli. And but it was a big learning curve. I had to really, really learn quickly about contemporary art and, you know, learn really to understand what was good and what wasn't good. I
Mm.
really honestly at the time, and I'm sure some of our students still feel this, I couldn't have told you why a work of contemporary art in like a suburban gallery was not really the kind of stuff that would ever enter a museum.
Right.
I really couldn't tell the difference. And, we have to learn those things. And you can
Sure.
only learn them, as you know, by going into the auction house previews, by going into
Hmm.
contemporary galleries like Whitechapel and, Tate Modern, and just really, really teaching yourself quickly and looking
Yeah,
and looking and looking, you know. So
exactly. I
that's
mean,
how I got into art business from art history.
it's no, I think it's a wonderful example of how, as you say, the paths that you take in this art world are never straightforward, and everybody has a different story of how
Yeah.
they ended up where they
Mm.
ended up.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
think it's wonderful. What I would say, I mean, the program, I loved it. We had a great time. We had a good group of people. The study trips were amazing. They were hilarious. They were
Mm.
extremely educational at the same time. I mean, I'm thinking about TAFE last year was I mean, it was eye opening and mind blowing. I've never been to a fair like that in my entire life. It really is on a whole nother level to some of these other things that you see out there. Um,
Yeah, I remember that I had some illness at that point, so I didn't
mm,
go to TPAP, but I did go to St Ives, and you came on the St Ives trip
exactly.
to,
Yes, and that was
in
that
Con.
was wonderful.
Yeah,
That was really
and we
wonderful.
actually
And
did some curating and hanging
hmm
with Alicia Livingston,
correct.
who's another podcast guest.
Yeah.
She's now moved out to St Ives for reasons I won't go into. She's now moving to
Okay.
Truro, which is like the county town of
Mm,
Cornwall. But it's a
yeah.
bit of a shame. St Ives is such an amazing artist colony,
Yeah.
and has a branch of Tate, of course.
Exactly. That's
And do you
that's
remember
that.
the
Yeah. It's
drawing
disappointing.
exercises in the Barbara
Oh yeah,
Hepworth
at the Barbara
Museum?
Hepworth gal, yeah, in the garden.
Yeah,
That was wonderful. I mean, my skills were not up to scratch, but
doesn't matter.
it was great. I mean, I was actually amazed at that. I mean, the collection of what they have in St. Ives was stunning. Although I do
Yeah.
remember it absolutely pouring with rain as we walked up to the what was the Potters,
Bernard Leach.
Bernard Leach, exactly,
Mm.
and getting absolutely drenched as we walked
Yeah.
up those hills.
Yeah, well, it's on
But
the Atlantic, so you get all of when the wind's in the southwest, you get
oh,
all of the clouds coming from the Central America coming over on the
you
Gulf
do,
Stream.
you do. But
Yeah,
yeah,
but
it's
it
it's
often passes quickly there.
yeah, it did. It was a heavy downpour, and then it was lovely. So
Yeah, isn't it?
just enough to get you soaked. But I think that's the beauty. And as you say, when you go in and you experience these things firsthand, that's the only real way to kind of get an understanding. It's nice that it's very hands on, rather than. I mean, you can deal in theory, but theory only takes you so far when it comes to these
Sure.
things.
Sure.
So
Handling
that.
objects and
Hmm.
seeing the material objects rather than reading books is what the MA Art business is all about, because it's an emerging academic discipline which probably we and our students, I think our students are underrated. Their dissertations there's so little scholarly material on this that they
Yeah.
tend to have to go out and do fieldwork, observational research, and interviews. So they're actually spearheading this as an academic discipline, I would say.
Yeah.
So you have to go out there and look and visit galleries and look at buildings and everything.
Yeah. And obviously being in London is, you have everything at your fingertips there, which
Yeah.
is which is truly, truly special, not just in terms of the city itself, but the ease in which you can get to Europe and things like that is pretty spectacular.
That's true, actually. Yeah, I often wonder why people choose London as opposed to, say, New York, where
Yeah.
there's an institute. But they both have their benefits. But for example, a couple of weeks ago, I took a group of this year's students to the Bloomberg Building,
Mm.
which itself is interesting as a sustainable building by Norman Foster. But
Yeah.
when they were building it, they found a huge amount of ancient Roman archaeological objects,
Right.
which are now on display in this art space. And they
Amazing.
opposite that ancient material, they have the contemporary artist. And of course, beneath the whole building, they have the ancient Roman temple of Mithras,
Wow.
which is an immersive experience
Yeah.
when you go
It's
into. So
unbelievable.
it kind of ticks all the boxes of art business. It's
Yeah.
high tech, immersive, ancient and Roman cross collecting, sustainability.
Yeah, it's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, I think like when I came to the end of the program and finished my thesis and all of that good stuff, I was kind of reflecting on the big takeaways of
Mm.
the program and my experience. But I'd love to hear sort of your perspective. Obviously, as we've already said, there's so many cross purposes with our business. Financial, historical, creative, artistic, all these different aspects. So what are some of the key things that you hope, like, a student who comes into the program, what do you want them to sort of walk away with?
It's a really nice question because I think a lot of people think that an art business MA is going to be a little bit like maybe an MBA
Hmm.
with a focus on art, and that it's some kind of business school sausage machine where really we're only kind of studying finance and how to make money and so on. And I think
Yeah.
hopefully you realize, I think the MA, I always wanted to keep it more than that because I recognize that the students uh, were coming from an art historical background. So that was what their passion was. Students were often career changing and they were deliberately
Hmm.
moving into this world because they didn't like what they were doing. Often they're like
Yeah.
law students. We get quite a lot of people who want a career change from law. So we, and ironically, of course, we have a lot of law
Yeah.
the program. It's really essential that our students understand where the legal problems might be if they're working in a gallery, auction house, or any other kind of art industry. They're not going to be able to be the lawyer, but at least they know when there might be a legal problem, and hopefully also the underlying ethical pinnings of
Hmm.
law, that they understand when it's actually not right to take cash which might be money laundering, and that they're not just going to do it to make a quick buck. I think we hope that the students come out with an understanding of the legal and ethical implications of what they're doing in what is often a for-profit art world, not always, but often a for-profit art world, obviously, and that it's an interdisciplinary degree, which makes it really difficult to do well in. You've got to
Yeah.
be able to do like a spreadsheet and create an attractive aesthetic index and a clear index of maybe an artist or an art market sector's development through time. And at the same time, you've got to understand, in the law exam that we have to do, they did it a couple of weeks ago. You're
I
given a
remember that one.
case. Yeah, exactly. And you're
Oh
told,
yeah.
you're buying this work of art from Moscow and you're moving it to a collector in New York. What are the legal issues with this
Hmm.
object? And deliberately the object might be something maybe with ivory in it, which has ethical issues about moving
Hmm.
ivory around the world and so on. So and out of all that multidisciplinariness, my personal hope is that our students who might come in thinking in a very, very blinkered way about the art world, maybe only ever theoretical approaches to a work of art from their art history, or if they're coming from a business background, I only want to see dollar signs. I don't want to see the art and aesthetic ideas behind an Andy Warhol dollar sign. I just want to see the dollars.
Yeah.
I hope also that they learn to think laterally, to
Mm.
learn to think outside the box, and to become entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And I know that some of our students, that's what happens to them. It transforms them through the year. And one of the most common thing parents or carers or loved ones of students say when I meet them at the degree ceremony, they seem to be really proud of their child, as all
Hmm.
parents are when they go to a degree ceremony. But the big thing they say to me is, "We can't believe how our daughter's changed."
Mm.
She at the start of this year, all she wanted to do was art, and and I didn't understand it. But now she knows about business as well. She's getting me into art, and I'm getting her into business. So it can really, really transform our students. That, I guess, that's the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and
Yeah.
that seems to be a quite regular outcome, I think, for our
Yeah.
students, that they really,
Yeah.
really, it really changes them.
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I think that overall, as the program goes on, it's definitely one of those experiences that you have that, you're for sure eternally grateful for. Meet good people, experience amazing things, and learn a lot along the way, which is kind of the key thing. But as you say, it's a developing field, and I think for sure something that will continue to grow. And what I've found most interesting coming out of it and starting my own business now and doing a whole bunch of other things along with it is the fact that, you know, I talk to young artists a lot, and they come out of art school with no knowledge of how to navigate the art world. Um,
Yes.
and that I think is really interesting. In some respects, I feel like, oh, there's a space here for this type of course, this MA in art business, but specifically for people who are pursuing an art career, like as an artist, because they have very little understanding of how the market works and kind of go into decision making processes that are not necessarily clear to them as to why they need to think about things in a certain way. So I think that's a whole area. So maybe Sotheby's needs to look into that as well.
Yeah, I think that so quite a lot of our students, as you might remember,
Mm,
and they struggle because of it,
yeah,
are from art school. They've been to
yeah,
Central St Martin's. They've done studio art, and and from all over the world. From China, from New York. That we get a lot of fine art students coming to us because they say, "Look, I really want to stay in this world, but I don't have the confidence to think that I'm ever going to make enough money by being
yeah.
an artist," which is quite sad in some ways. And I always encourage them to
It's
carry
yeah.
on that. And they can struggle, I think, therefore, with the lack of, if they haven't done art history, then they might struggle with academic essay writing because art school doesn't teach them that either.
Yeah.
And it's certainly, I mean, very few art schools, as far as I know, have a module which they should have on entering the art world and entering the
Yeah.
art, understanding the art market when you graduate. They don't like, a lot of art teachers or artists themselves, they don't like money. They don't like talking about it. That's from my experience.
Yeah.
I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that Damien Hirst has said that one of the reasons he became so entrepreneurial, he said, was because Goldsmiths, where he studied art, did actually have a little module, or they did teach them about the art
Hmm.
market. Now, I've never checked that out, but I've heard
Yeah.
him say it, and it may have become a bit of a myth. Who knows? But generally speaking, I don't think they teach about moving into how to move into the real world. And I have another little anecdote about the MA Art
Mm.
business that, very in the early days, it may have even been in the first year. I'm just trying to remember. It's in one of the first 2 or 3 years. We had an artist, Henry Simonson. I continue to follow his Instagram. He's really
Mm.
developed as a painter, particularly of nature. Really, really beautiful, very detailed sort of paintings of plants and flowers. And in fact, he might even be listening to this. And so, shout out to Henry. I'm hoping that he will be my guest. We have been, wondering about when we might do this.
Mm.
And the reason for that is because when he came to study BMA, he had this amazing story. He said, I'm with a little group of, like, a commune of artists living in Brighton,
Yeah.
and we realized that all of us are naive about the art market, about how to
Yeah.
make money from our art. So we decided that we would all put a share of money into one of us coming to do this course, and we drew lots for it. And he said, I drew the short straw, and here I am. So he came and studied the MA business and went back and shared his understanding with his fellow artists, and
Wow.
I think he's still down in, and doing
Yeah.
very well now. So
I love
that
that.
you know,
I love that. I think that's amazing. And I was talking to actually a few people the other week, and I said to them, I was like, "Why? Artists have become very individualized in this era of e-commerce and social media and everything like that, and they don't work together in the same way. And, these forming of these groups, like what you had with the secessionists or, the Wiener Werkstatt or whatever, the Impressionists, all these people, who work together to kind of develop art and to also make it work as a business. That doesn't really happen as often anymore, which I
I
find
think you're
really
right.
interesting,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think those kind of movements of artists, I mean, you know, the YBAs, the Young British
Mm,
Artists, to keep coming back to that group of artists, pretty much led by Hirst in terms of the
yeah,
entrepreneurship of them. But there's a whole load of them who are now really internationally famous, of course. But they never really saw themselves as a group, apparently.
no,
And when you look at their art, it's quite different.
yeah,
A lot of it is really different from Sarah Lucas is very different from Hirst, and Hirst
yeah,
is
of
different
course.
from Chris O'Feely and Peter
Hmm.
Doig, Rachel White-Reed, but they were all doing really amazing, innovative things, and that is
Yeah,
because they had this. I think it's because they did have this feeling that I've got to live in the real world. I've got to struggle and find a way. I want to carry on doing this, and I don't
yeah,
want to go and have to teach art. I want to actually just keep making art and have the time to do that. So, and now we look back at them, we label them. Whereas I think the groups you're talking about, they often would produce a manifesto, the
hmm,
Dada group,
yeah,
the Blau Reiter group. They would create a manifesto and say, we are going to be this group of artists, and that
exactly.
continued. Probably groups like Zero in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Whether it still exists or not, I don't know. And forgive me, anyone listening to this, if you are part of the group, we'd like to hear from you.
Oh,
But you
yeah,
don't hear it.
absolutely.
Artists, I think, like human beings, have got more selfish. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily their fault, but they're struggling just to find, make their own way in
Yeah,
the world.
exactly. Exactly. And I think that it's sad because I think there's an opportunity there in a
Mm.
lot of ways. And certainly from a business perspective, the pooling of resources, the pooling of talent, it's a common practice in most industries, one way or
Yes.
another. So it's something that I think, just the people I've been talking to, I'm like, consider it, if you know people and you want to work together on something, it's not a bad idea. Um, but I think it's a struggle in that sense, and I think in some ways that's sort of, as you just said, there's that element of selfishness, egoism, things like that, and I think that it's sort of reflective of the times in which we live. Obviously, there's that sense of disconnection that a lot of people feel. And the artist, I think, is in some ways, it's supposed to be the voice of that, but is maybe struggling in that sense of finding what it is that right now, this moment is what they should be saying almost.
Yeah, and it's a post-COVID situation, definitely.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation with Top Taylor, who used to be one of the
Mm, yeah.
co-curator of Rifle Maker, very well-known gallery in London. And he joined us in St Ives because he lives partly down there now.
Mm,
And we had a conversation over lunch, and we were talking about. We said, "What's happening now?" We talked about the nothing time that we seem to
mm,
be in at the moment. And I said, I'm sure we're wrong, Top, because something will come out of this. But he said, yeah, but it's like slack water. The
mm,
tide isn't moving either in or out at the moment.
yeah.
It really, I don't know what you feel about that, Jeremy, but
Yeah.
you can't quite see where things are going at the moment.
I do. I feel that. And in the sense, especially when I look at, we talked a lot about this on the course when we talked about ultra contemporary arts
Yes.
and the ultra contemporary artists, however you want to brand them or talk
Yeah.
about them. I find it lacking, in the sense that it's here 1 second and then they're gone the next.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, well, but what was it? Did it have an impact? Am I thinking about it? Do I want to see it again? It doesn't feel like there's anything to kind of, it's not hardened onto a specific idea. And personally, and I'm a bit biased because I mean this podcast is called an aesthetic education. I like to think about aesthetics, but I find that the lack of beauty in any sort of sense, um, which has become sort of a common feature in ultra contemporary art, I find not particularly interesting.
Yeah, no,
And that's just my
and of course
opinion.
this no, but you've put your finger on one of the big historical problems about art, and the way the Greeks and Romans got over that problem was basically the philosophical ideas about moving in two directions, I would say. One, into the notion of that there is this geometric, perfect, ideal world, the Platonic view of art. And a lot of today's artists, when you talk to them, they're very into Platonic ideas of art. Of course, the Renaissance was really into that, the architects and the artists. But on the other hand, they were saying that art imitates nature. That the whole point of art is to actually, for the artist, the sculptor, or the painter, to produce something that's almost more realistic than the real thing. That's I guess that's the way they solve that. And then, of course, with modernism, you get this they go deliberately against that classical idea that art should imitate nature. I think maybe they go for more of the Platonic idea, or a lot of them did. People like Ben Nicholson that we saw in St. Ives with those wonderful sort of circles and triangles he often puts in his works, and Hepworth to a certain extent. And it's a problem, isn't it? Because many people would say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and many people would say, actually, I do find a lot of that ultra contemporary art aesthetic and beautiful. It's I would say, from my point of view, that some of it I do find very beautiful and aesthetic. But it's I'm aware that is quite subjective.
Sure.
But you're the person. You did your dissertation with my colleague Oliver, I think. On the application of like Kantian ideas on aesthetics to art. So maybe I mean, have you ever spoken about that on this podcast? Because maybe you could say where your ideas are coming from.
I mean, we've talked about it in other ways. Like, just the last week's episode was on Schiller, who I included in my dissertation. But yeah, I talked about I did an episode on Plato and his theory of forms a few weeks ago. So I mean, it's always a very complicated thing. I mean, and as you know, if anybody wants to read my dissertation, it will be available at the library at some point. And all you have to do is travel to London. But the interesting thing about it, I think, is that when you talk about taste, and Kant's really kind of quite explicit on the fact that taste is both subjective, but there is that sort of objective element of it. So it has to contain certain qualities of it. How you interpret those qualities is, I mean, this is when we get into philosophy, and anything can sort of be taken in 1,000 different directions. But I find it interesting in the sense that if you think about it from a philosophical perspective, from an aesthetic perspective, beauty has to deal with some element of truth. So that's when we can deal with, the ultra contemporary and beginning to kind of understand that and seeing that element of beauty in there. I think the danger of today and, the lack of philosophical understanding that sort of comes with all this modern thought in some ways is that we can tend towards nihilism. And if there's nihilism, then there can't be beauty. So in my opinion,
maybe that's what Todd and I meant by nihil is obviously the Latin for nothing, nothingness, and that we feel as though we're perhaps in a nothing age. I don't know whether that is to do with nihilism, but you're getting me into like a philosophical frame of mind now, and feel that you maybe that's another podcast. But I think that I don't know. I'm a judge on. I've been a judge on a couple of emerging artists panels, and this is literally the first one I was a judge on. We had to choose people that weren't selling their art in any big way, that had never won a prize before. It was honestly, and I would have to look through. We all had to look through thousands of entries, and my eye just got attuned to. I went past a lot of stuff that probably you would say was actually really quite aesthetic and beautiful, but to me it wasn't interesting in the sense that it was a great artist who was really good at. There's a lot of very good portraitists who do really really beautiful portraits, for example, but it wasn't kind of challenging anything to me. And so the few works in the end that I created as a shortlist were often probably things that you might see as unaesthetic, but in my opinion they had some other kind of truth behind them. But then my way of looking at art is that I quite like the challenge of that, and I try to work out what the artist is actually
Sure.
trying to say to me,
Yeah.
because I think that this person isn't doing this for the hell of it.
No.
They're not trying to be clever. Some artists are trying to be clever, but I think this person is doing it because they have a message for me.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
it's up to me to work out what's happening in that space between me and the work of art I'm looking at, which becomes then a conversation with this absent person. But
Mm.
I think in their art, you're seeing into their mind and into
Yeah.
their way of thinking.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, that person may not be someone with, say, my religious views, or but I do think good art has to have what you're coming to what you're saying in another way. I do think there has to be an element of what of whatever we mean by truth in it, something
Yeah.
something that is like eternal. It could be mythological, it could be platonic forms, but it is to do with some eternal truth that
Yeah.
philosophers over the centuries have actually discussed.
Exactly.
And there's different, but the problem, as Pontius Pilate famously said to Jesus,
Yeah.
"What is truth?" I mean, and
Exactly.
this is the This is the issue.
It is.
It's constantly fascinating.
It's I think, and what I hope people, the listeners, sort of take away from this brief, discussion that we've had, and just how much there is out there.
Mm.
There's so much to consider, and you can come at it from a philosophical angle. I enjoy that debate. I love looking at it from that perspective, and I love also changing my mind, right? I love not understanding a piece and then actually thinking, oh, that's horrible, to then switching. I'm like, no, I actually see something way more in depth on that. And I think that's kind of the joy of that. But
And
you don't have to go that.
Sometimes it takes, like, your art history.
Mm,
A lot of the students I interview, I notice in their transcripts, they say, "Oh, I was really inspired by a particular professor. They did this amazing course on an artist,
yeah,
Michelangelo or whatever, and then that's what makes me want to do this for the rest of my life." So sometimes it can come from a mentor, I think, whose own
exactly.
passion for making you see through their eyes, if you like, what you might otherwise not see.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when people look at that and they take a moment, and then they can develop their own aesthetic understanding,
Mm-hmm.
because it only comes with experience and familiarity. And
Mm-hmm.
then obviously within the historical context, you can look at anything and begin to sort of grapple with those types of things. It was when I started that topic for the thesis, Oliver was like, "Oh my God, what are we? This is too big." And then we eventually were able to narrow it down.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, but I think there's like taking on those big tasks and taking on those big understandings with art is something that you can do any day and at any time. And that's quite a nice thing. I don't know of many other industries or things like that that allow you to have that, thoughtful opportunity to think about life and other things in so many different ways.
Yeah, and people often say, "Oh, what a luxury." But it isn't. It's about fundamental truths in life. When you get to my kind of age and have been through some of the medical issues I've recently been through, it does actually force you to think about mortality and immortality, and what is the point, what is truth, and I think it changes your way of looking at the art as well.
Yeah.
But when I think back, I was thinking about the art in that way the moment I got switched on to this thing called art. Immediately, that's what I found compelling about it.
Yeah. It's that spark.
Yeah.
The first episode I did of this podcast was about Prometheus, um,
Wow.
and that spark of creativity. So I
Yeah.
think I think that's really our point of origin, honestly, and that's
Yeah.
where all of this kind of comes from, which I think is a really powerful piece.
And of course,
Um,
before Prometheus stole fire from the gods, they had deliberately kept it from us human
yep,
beings so that we
correct,
couldn't become cultured, so that we had
exactly.
to eat raw meat, so we couldn't
Hmm.
heat ourselves. So it was the spark of culture as well as a practical thing to have.
Exactly,
on, on
exactly, and
life.
that's
So
why that's why for Byron he was a hero, and that's where that's
yeah,
why we
and
can go into
that's why the
that.
god. Always reminds me of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as well.
Hmm.
That
Sure.
kind of that fire that Zeus didn't want us humans beings to have. It's because we could become them like gods. And as you know, Nietzsche and co
Yeah.
Also, Zarathustra is all about that becoming like a Superman and a god-like figure. So that was a very interesting myth, the Promethean myth.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But I do just want to finish off, David, with a few quick fire questions, if that's okay, just to get your little reaction. So, if you could see an artist working in person, they don't have to be alive; they can be alive or dead or whatever. Who would you want to have the privilege to see working in person?
Oh, as someone from the ancient world, I would say, because I guess that otherwise I'm going to say what everyone else is, what a lot of other people are going to say, like Michelangelo working on the Sistine ceiling must have been an amazing experience. But from the ancient world, I think I'd like to be back when Nero's Domus Aurea, his golden house, which has been partly excavated in Rome, was being built and decorated by this very strange painter who was strange because he was Roman and an aristocrat. His name was we don't know if his name was Famulus or Fabulous, because there's two textual traditions, but it's either Famulus or Fabulous. And I think it's Suetonius, the ancient historian, who, when he's talking in his life of Nero, he says that he used to wear his toga while he was painting to show that he wasn't a Greek slave artist, that he was actually a Roman citizen, and that was really, really unusual. And of course, the other thing about his work is that when you visit the Domus Aurea, the archaeological excavations, you realize how innovative he was, because this is where we get grotesque style from. It's where Raphael saw them and copied them in the lodges in the Vatican, and then they appear in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And the grotesque style, i.e. basically monsters like human figures emerging from vegetal or animal forms. That grotesque style is what we find in the Golden House of Nero. We don't really know whether Fabulous invented that. Maybe it was just the sort of Zeitstyle, but he's the one that I would like to have a peep at painting. I think it must have been amazing seeing this guy wearing a Roman toga.
Oh my gosh.
And trying not to get the colors from his frescoes onto this pure white garment.
Amazing. Okay, wonderful. Favorite museum to visit?
The one that first comes to my mind is the Bayeux collection just outside Basel, because I like the architect Renzo Piano, did the Shard in London, and obviously worked on the Pompidou Centre with Richard Rogers. And Mr. Bayeux requiescat in pace. He died a few years back. We took the MA Art business students. We'd gone there for Art Basel primarily. We took a coach out. It's just outside of Basel. Beautiful building, the Renzo Piano, wonderful modernist collection. And he came out and met us when we got off the coach. And this was this incredibly well internationally famous sort of art collector. And I remember particularly loving that gallery for its architecture and its and how wonderfully inviting he was, and to want to share his own art collection, with us and with the students. But honestly, that's just what came into my mind for some reason. And obviously, if I thought about it, I'd probably come up with something else.
That's okay. It's quick fire. The last one, the best exhibition that you have seen recently.
Easy. Actually, again, I've got probably two answers: old and new art. Certainly the best one I've seen recently, because it really made me cry a lot and laugh a lot, was Marina Abramovich's retrospective at the Royal Academy in London. Oh wow! And and there were things that it's interactive as well. So she makes you do things to what an amazing artist. Experiential artist who suffers herself. It always reminds me almost of biblical figures, and the suffering for the sake of other people. And I think another question you might have going to answer feeds into that, which is, what are artists for? And in my opinion, artists are like she was. They can do things and suffer for us, almost like religious figures, in a way that we don't have time to or don't have the guts to ourselves. And I also think artists see beyond the horizon before the rest of us do. So that's why some of that contemporary art, the stuff, the contemporary art I really like is the more challenging, difficult stuff. I think when you're talking about those ultra contemporary artists, you're often talking about very, very commercial artists. I'm doing the air quotes there, who are kind of selling, making a quick buck now. Arguably, have they got anything deeper in amongst them? But I think the good artists are ones that that are doing the thinking for us.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thinking ahead of the horizon a little bit before we do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I was obviously not in London to see that, but I heard amazing things about that exhibition. So she's, I mean, I think that for anybody who hasn't had the privilege to see, who's gone to London and seen what's on offer there, it really is a must, because no matter when you turn up, there's something happening and there's something to look at. So
yeah, and that afternoon I went to the Queen's Gallery.
I love that
for
one.
A very different exhibition of Holbein. And
amazing.
Great Renaissance portraitist, working for Henry VIII, obviously, and that again incredibly beautiful in a very, very different way.
Absolutely, totally different context. But the Queen's Gallery, they always, when they put on an exhibition, it's so thoughtful. And they're just dealing with the royal collection, but it's so amazing what they have in that collection. It's outstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Very different world, obviously, from Abramovich. But that's another nice thing about art. I do try to do two binary opposite things in a day. I often think, well, I'll go to a kind of traditional exhibition or a heritage exhibition, then I'll go to something that's going to challenge me.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's nice. And as I said, London is the place for that, because nowhere else will you have all those different pieces coming together.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess New Yorkers would probably argue otherwise, and probably Parisians would. But I think I get where you're coming from. I think London. What I would say about London compared to those other two cities, I would strongly argue that it's far more diverse and open to ideas and multiculturalism than even New York and Paris.
Yeah, certainly from an art perspective, I would say, absolutely. But well, David, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation, and I know that our listeners will have not only learned a lot, but hopefully enjoyed it as much as I did as well. So really, thank you so much for spending your time and your afternoon with us, and I hope that we can get you on again in the not too distant future. Yeah,
and I might repay the compliment by asking you to guest on mine once your business is up and going for a few months.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Do that. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Awesome.
It was a great pleasure.
If you enjoyed this show, please give us a follow on your preferred podcast listening platform, as well as on Instagram or Facebook, where you can find us under altalena.art. A link to David's podcast and social media can be found in the description of this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to welcoming you back real soon.